In today's video, we're going to look at how you can work with server binding with the grid for ASP.NET MVC and the Telerik extensions for ASP.NET MVC. There are several different types of binding modes available with the grid, server being one of them, Ajax, web service, and custom binding being some of the other options. But today we're just going to look at how you can configure and work with server-based binding. Another way to describe server-based binding is binding that works with HTTP GETs and query strings in the URL. All information is communicated to the server over a GET, and all the different formatting for the data is communicated through the URL. So let's see how we set this up. In Visual Studio 2008, I have a standard ASP.NET MVC2 project created, and I've configured it to work with the Telerik extensions for ASP.NET MVC. I've also created a very simple link to SQL Northwind data context that we can use for data binding in today's demos. So since my project's been set up correctly, the first thing we can do is just go ahead and create a very basic grid definition on our view. So I'm going to open up some server tags, type html.telerik, and then I find the grid extension off of the Telerik extension method. From here, there are a few different ways we can pass our data into our grid when working with server binding. In fact, these approaches are the same for the other binding types as well, so these options will be universal regardless of the type of binding you're doing. One option is to specify the type right here with our grid definition and doing it explicitly using generics. So in this case, we're going to bind to the customer's data from Northwind. So I can simply type customer, which is our data type. But because we're dealing with MVC views, we need to provide the fully qualified namespace to get to our customer object. So I can simply come in here and let Visual Studio fill that out for me. Once I've specified my object type and told the grid what type of object it's going to be binding to, which will help the grid automatically create columns for that object type, I then need to actually hand it the data I want it to work with, or a list, an IEnumerable. One option for doing that is to pass it in directly here in the opening statement for my grid declaration. In fact, I can simply specify a string key value like customers, and that's shorthand to automatically tell the grid to look into the view data for this view and look for a customer's key to load my data from there. Once I've specified that, I just need to set a few additional properties like name, the HTML ID for my grid. We'll just call this grid1. And then I can configure the different behaviors I want my grid to support when it runs in the view. And because it's so easy, I'm just going to go ahead and make it a pageable grid, a sortable grid, a filterable grid, and with the latest release, a groupable grid as well. And I'm not going to need to write any additional code to support those operations thanks to the grid's built-in link data engine. And finally, as with any Telerik extension, .render tells the control that it's done being configured and will spit out the proper HTML. So with this configuration set, my grid is ready to run, be completely pageable, sortable, and filterable, but I need to get that data into my view data so the grid can grab it. So I'm going to go to my home controller, and the action result for the index method, the method that will be called when that view loads, or rather the method will be called and then it'll return that view, I need to put the data in here. So I'll simply create a new Northwind data context, new Northwind data context, and bring in the right namespace. And from here, I can simply return my data. And we said in this case, it expects to be found in the view data collection. So I can say view data, and we already wanted to call that customers. And now I can simply say db.customers.toList as an example. And when I do this and run my page, what we should see is my grid fully functional, bound to my list of customers coming from my Northwind database. And here we do see my page. We see it's auto-generated the columns from my object. I could, of course, define my columns collection if I wanted to narrow this down. And we see that we have operations like paging. As I click from page 1 to page 2, we can see the data changes, 2 to 3. This continues to work. I can sort this. So let me go ahead and sort, let's say, by contact title. And you can see we remain on page 3, and we've now sorted by contact title. As I'm performing these operations, because, as I said at the beginning, these are working with HTTP GETs and the URL string, you can see the data is being added here to the URL bar, and that's how the server knows what to return to display in the grid. So let's look at some other options you have for passing data into the grid. If we go back to Visual Studio, another option for configuring your view, as opposed to passing in simply a key to your view data here, you can actually pass in your entire view data at this point, and you can even omit the object declaration or the object type here. So I'm going to remove that. Instead of just doing the customer's key, I'm going to put in the full view data customers access here. And I need to cast that to the right object type as well. So I'm going to cast this to a list of customer, which I'll need to fully qualify. And let's do that with Visual Studio's assistance. And this will function just as our previous declaration did as well. It's an alternative way of passing in your data, and it can be any IEnumerable here. And if I were to rerun this as well, we'd see that we have an identically functioning page. And since I didn't show it last time, just to show you that it's functioning here, I could drag something like city into the group bar, and we can see that the MVC grid now also supports grouping. Now, if we go back then, one additional option for specifying this data is to actually specify it in a property within the grid called bind to. It has the exact same effect. It's just another option for configuring the grid. I do, in this case, though, have to specify the object type. So where it was optional before, when I use bind to, I do need to specify here what type my object is. So in this case, my grid data binding .models.customer. Once I've done that, I can simply move my data, the entire statement I used before, including the cast, from the opening declaration statement method down to bind to, save and run. We'll once again see the same effect. So you can see it has the same effect, all of this leading to binding my data, all remaining functional and allowing me to do things like paging, sorting, and even filtering. Let's select only company names that start with A and filter. No additional work required. All this work's all being done with server binding, and as you can see, all changing and modifying the URL as we go. Now, one additional option for getting your data into your grid is actually if you're using strongly typed views, you can just simply pass in the strongly typed model. So let's go ahead and create a new action result. Let's go ahead and create public action result customers. And in this case, let's just go ahead and return to our view our data from our Northwind database. And in this case, let's also return it as an iQueryable as opposed to a list. And there's a certain advantage in that we'll take a look at in just a second. So we'll say new Northwind data context. And in this case, customers. And if we just return it like this without calling toList, we're actually returning an iQueryable of customers. So now from here, we can use the Visual Studio tooling to go ahead and add our view. And let's go ahead and make it a strongly typed view. And the strongly type we want to use is for our customer object. And let's go ahead and leave this as empty for now so it doesn't generate any markup for us. And we'll click Add. And then here we'll go ahead and quickly define our grid. And to save some time, I'll copy and paste our grid definition from the other page, the other view. And we'll customize it from here. Instead of using the bind to property now, because we're on a strongly typed view, and because we're here, I can get rid of this as well. I can simply come into my grid, and in the opening method of the extension methods here, just simply enter my model, and that'll pass in my strongly typed model for this view. Now, if I go up to my page declaration, we can see that right now the strongly typed model is system.web.mvc view page and of a grid binding model customer object, a single object. Well, we actually are returning a collection of objects to this page, so we need to modify this to be of a collection type. And since we're returning an iQueryable, we don't want to make this a list. This is actually going to be a link table. So we can say system.data.link.table of type customer. And if we save this, we now see that the error check goes away on our page. And if we run this in the browser, we should see the same function as we did before, only it's going to grab that data model right from our page and display it in the browser. So we'll Control F5. And now if we go to /home/customer, or customers, let's double check that. Customers, plural. We see our grid once again functioning with things like paging, sorting, and filtering still in place, all using server binding and behaving the way expected to. Just a different way to configure it if you're working with strongly typed views. Now, through all this, you've noticed that as the URL has been changing, there's been this prefix here, grid1, and then, in this case, -page2. If we were to apply some sorting in this view, we'd see grid1 order by. The prefix in server binding is to allow you to have multiple grids on the page. And by default, the prefix is placed there so that you can have multiple grids without a problem. If you are only going to have one grid on a page, you can eliminate that prefix through another property when working with server binding. And it's very easy to do. We can go back to our definition, simply set prefix URL parameters to false. And if we review this in the browser, now when we navigate to things like pages, we can see that the page 2 value shows up, but we no longer have the grid prefix. It's a convenient way to shorten the URL length when working with server binding without necessarily requiring you to change the routing or make custom routing. Now, in this case with the strongly typed view, one of the things we did was we returned a iQueryable as opposed to an IEnumerable or list. And the reason we did that is because the built-in linked data engine in the grid will actually take advantage of an iQueryable and push the filtering, the paging, the sorting, all of those shaping data effects all the way back to the data server. In other words, you'll only be bringing back from the database the actual data you need to display, as opposed to bringing back all of the data and then shaping it in memory. Significant way to improve performance. So let's take a look at that and see what the effect is and see how the grid's built-in linked data engine does that. To examine the effect, I'm actually going to use a simple tool, an open source tool, that is essentially providing SQL profiler-like services for SQL Express. And what this tool allows us to do is run a new trace on our SQL Express database and see exactly what SQL is being executed when we perform different actions with our MVC grid. So I'm going to go ahead and trace all of our remote process starting commands and our SQL statement commands. We'll go ahead and click run. This is now going to trace any behavior happening with our SQL Express database, a simple free open source tool, very convenient for this purpose. And if we now go back, we'll run this demo again. And remember, this demo is using the iQueryable. So operations we perform with this should be shaping our data in some way before it goes back to the database. That's different from our our original view, which is using the list of data. So this is actually an IEnumerable that's been put into memory and then shaped from there. So let's actually start by looking at the list and see what that does to our SQL. So we're going to hit Control F5 and view this in the browser. If we go now and check our SQL profiler, we'll see right away that the first thing we've done is selected all the data from our customers tables. You can see that all the columns here, there's no shaping or filtering on it on the database side. We've simply selected it all and brought it back. Now let's go back to the browser. Let's go ahead and page this data. Let's go ahead and page from page 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Let's go see what's happening at the database level. You can see as we're paging here, different select SQL statements are being issued, and every time we're doing an operation like paging, we're bringing back all of the data again. So you could clearly improve the performance here by doing some amount of data caching in memory, but in this case, when you don't do that, the grid is not able to automatically provide any optimization for you. You're bringing back all the data and then shaping it, in this case with paging, once it's back in the server memory. If you're working with something like iQueryable, on the other hand, let's see what the effect is there. Let's go ahead and clear this and go to our customers demo. We'll go ahead and load this from scratch. So just for the initial load, let's see what's happened in our SQL profiler. In this case now, you can see two SQL statements have fired. First, we've performed a count SQL statement, and that's required because now that we're not bringing back all of the data, we need to know what is the total size of the data so that we can effectively do paging. The second statement we fire is to select only the top 10 records from our customers table. So we've already shaped it to only bring back the top 10 customers into memory as opposed to all customers. So that's an improvement right off the bat. Let's perform some other operations. Let's do a paging from 1 to 2. Let's go ahead and do some filtering as well. Let's filter, show that all companies that start with A. So let's see what happens now with our SQL. In this case, you can see once again we performed a count in there when we were doing the paging. And then when we paged, you can see here that using the link to SQL generated SQL and the linked data engine in the Telerik grid, we've automatically generated the correct code with skip and take to bring back just the records we're viewing for that page. And then when we did filtering, you can see that we automatically generated the correct code to bring back the records for the page we're looking at and records that only match, in this case, the name that starts with A. So the SQL is being shaped automatically by the grid's built-in link engine, pushed all the way to the server, and that's the advantage of iQueryable and the automatic built-in support for doing that when you're working with the grid for ASP.NET MVC. Hopefully this quick look at how you work with server binding, the various ways to bring data into the grid, and the optimizations of working with things like lists versus iQueryable give you exactly what you need to get started with server-based binding, HTTP GIDs, and the URL in your ASP.NET MVC applications.